Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. I am finally doing my fight-by-fight breakdown for Abyss of Legends Path 5. As always, there's a link to the spreadsheet, the Reddit link where I got my map that has all of the node information, etc., as well as a link to the map preview itself in the description below. I will be just running through the spreadsheet, so if you'd rather read it yourself, go ahead and do that. But that said, the spreadsheet is organized as follows. So I have nodes, common attackers, whether or not I think you should boosts, mastery considerations, and then playstyle notes for the champions that I mentioned as common attackers. The first fight in Path 5 is Iron Man Infinity War. The defender has a permanent armor up, and tech champions are immune to AAR and nullify while they have an armor up, so the only way to remove it is with an armor break, and then the armor up returns after 15 seconds once the armor break expires. While the tech champion has the armor up, they gain a charge when struck, and at 10 charges, they steal the attacker's power. Common attackers here are Aegon, Void, Torch, and Red Magneto. Generally speaking, you should boost here. Mastery considerations, there are none. If you're using Aegon, you can use him to ramp up here. Typically, a one-shot option is used instead because Aegon with 0 charge, really not ideal. But if you are going to use him, just make sure you play around the node because Iron Man Infinity War will constantly be stealing your power. Next up is Void. If you're going to use him, slow and steady is the pace. Ideally, you have Petrify or Fear of the Void active for the last 15%. Otherwise, the power gain is going to be an issue. If you're using Torch for the one shot, you want to use the pre-fight and boosts. Parry the 2 shots from the SP1, but dex the SP2 because honestly the SP2 is significantly more chip damage. Essentially, your goal is to have as many smolders as possible for the last 15%, so Iron Man Infinity War goes down fast from a few Nova Flames. Also, Torch can easily heavy corner the Iron Man Infinity War if you want to avoid parry chip damage. And then finally, Red Magneto, SP3 for the win. Absolutely crush that Iron Man Infinity War. Next up is Invisible Woman. When the attacker/defender fills a bar of power, attacker is inflicted with a 15-second power sting. Power stings have a plus 50% ability accuracy. Unless the defender is under the effects of a debuff when a power sting expires, the attacker receives a 5-second stun. Common attackers here are Nick Fury, Aegon, Stealth Suit, Cull Obsidian, Hitmonkey, Archangel, Human Torch. Lots of options for this Invisible Woman, and she's easy to practice on if you can get through that Iron Man Infinity War for free. Yes, I generally recommend that you boost. Resonance is an optional mastery you can turn on here if you're not using Nick Fury. It's going to help prevent the stun from the power sting. This is a standard Invisible Woman fight, but you really need to break the shield to do damage, otherwise it's just going to be a really long fight. Nick Fury, once you're in the real Nick phase, use 2 SP1s to go unblockable. You can just tank the power sting damage. It's only like 3% per power sting, and it's worth taking the damage to secure a much easier fight. From there, it's just standard Nick Fury gameplay. If you're using a Resonance and a non-Nick, make sure that you use Resonate Mastery to really help prevent you from getting stunned, or you use a champion who can consistently apply debuffs to Invisible Woman. Next up is Gladiator Hulk. While below 25% HP, Gulk is heal blocked and his special attacks are unblockable. Gladiator Hulk cannot lose more than 10% of the attacker's base attack from a single strike. Common attackers here are Void, Torch, Nick Fury, Aegon, and Magneto, although Magneto's a little subpar. For the last 25%, I do recommend that you boost. If you're using a heal reverse option, make sure you have Despair, and Recoil can actually be used to really help set up that reverse healing at optimal times, because you can use the recoil time to when you have max heal reversal opportunities, drop a special, and then let recoil trigger the 20%. Deep Wounds is really nice if you're using a bleeder. If you're using Void, you're going to set up Fear of the Void and as many Petrify / as many other debuffs as possible, and then just cheese. The last 25%, you're better off swapping in like a bleeder or another option there. If you're using Torch, make sure you do not use the pre-fight. You're going to want to ramp to an SP2, either take block hits to trigger the 20% coin flip and heal reverse, or stun to maximize the amount of incinerates. And then once you trigger the heal reverse, you want to stun with the SP2, and then get as many incinerates in as possible. You can place or use recoil damage to drop below 20%, and this will trigger the coin flip. And then again, in the last 25%, you want to swap in a bleeder. If you're using Nick Fury, bleeds for days, and if you're using Aegon, SP2 bleeds for damage, and you'll get there eventually. That Gladiator Hulk is kind of a pain for a lot of people. Next up is Yellow Jacket. Yellow Jacket has a high chance to launch special attacks. Each time he does, he gains an efficiency charge, which refunds 5% of the cost of all special attacks. While above 2 powers of power, Yellowjack is power locked. So if you're using common attackers, Nick Fury, Aegon, generally speaking, any heavy hitter, yes, I recommend you boost. Masteries, it doesn't matter. For all the champions, you're going to want to bait L1s early and make sure you get the proper distancing to keep yourself from being clipped. After Yellowjacket has launched a couple of L1s, it's easy to push into an L2, bait the L2, and then punish. And then because of the node interactions with the power locking and the refunding, you can get him to a point where he's just permanently at an L2. You go ahead and you punish the L2, do a 5-hit, parry 5-hit until he launches it again, then you punish, and that's your opening every time, and you don't have to worry about L3 threat. If you're using Nick Fury, it's best to use the same method, but if you want an alternative aggressive method, you could push to unblockable on Nick Fury using your L1s, then use Nick's L2 to stun and punish Yellowjacket in the corner. The unblockable is going to give you a lot of really good openings and free hits. This Yellowjacket's a little passive on his specials a lot of times. And this works significantly better once Yellowjacket's at 2 bars of powers, because then you don't have to worry about potentially getting hit by the L1, and you can just keep him in the corner and hope that he doesn't launch the L2, and use your unblockable to just keep hitting into him over and over and over again. It's not as efficient resource-wise, but it works really, really well from a fast takedown perspective. Next up is Mordo. Every 10 buffs that expire or are nullified on the attacker, place a 15-second Fate Seal debuff on the attacker. If this is removed early, it deals 100% of the defender's attack as direct damage. Do not use Aegon here, but otherwise typical attackers are Torch and Void. Yes, I recommend that you boost. No Stupefy Mastery. It's optional, but it will help in case you do stun this Mordo. That way the parry stun timer is reduced and you don't get stuck in this awkward moment where Mordo is stunned, you can't hit him, and he's got the power gain, and just go straight to an L3. Otherwise, standard Mordo mechanics. Mephisto, every 10 buffs that expire / nullified on the attacker, place a 15-second Fate Seal debuff on the attacker. If this is removed early, it deals 100% of the defender's attack as direct damage. Again, do not use Aegon. Typical attackers here are Torch and Void. Any Incinerate Immune works though. Generally speaking, I recommend that you do not boost if you're using Torch. If you're using Void, go ahead and boost up. Masteries, there's no major consideration. Torch, this is an easy one-shot with the pre-fight. You can block the SP1 for Smolders, proximity while he's got the Aura of Incineration to gain Smolders. But if you don't have the pre-fight for some reason, you can use the L3 from Human Torch to get that damage phase. And then just do like a standard parry L3. That way you can dash in right away and get some Nova Flames on. And when you have a ton of Smolders, even just like a couple of Nova Flames absolutely blast this Mephisto down. He is one-shottable even without the pre-fight. Just be aware that if you're not having the pre-fight on and you're incinerating Mephisto, he does have passive power gain. Next up is Thor Ragnarok. Debuffs on Thor activate a power flood, granting 10% of his max power per second, and special attacks a 100% chance to be unblockable. Common attackers here are Aegon, Doom, and Red Magnetos. You should boost if you want the extra damage. Masteries, nothing to consider. If you're using Aegon, you're going to want to punish Thor's specials for damage openings, and then just don't use the SP2 or the SP3 because you're going to have a bad time. If you're using Red Magneto, the bleeds from the SP3 can and will trigger the node despite magnetization, but it is really good damage. You just have to make sure that you do a lot of special baiting immediately after launching the L3. And then if you're using Doom, you want to use a SP3 and SP1 only rotation. Do keep in mind that with Thor Rags, you have a lower shock duration from Doom, so you're going to want to adjust your combos accordingly. Next up is Aegon. The attacker has a minus 100% offensive ability accuracy except during special attacks. You can use anyone here. Yes, I recommend you boost. Mystic Dispersion can be really helpful if you're using a Mystic champion. For all champs, just beware of the block damage. Both the SP1 and the SP2 can be punished for your combo openings. Otherwise, the chip damage from Aegon can be pretty massive. If you're using a Mystic champion, what you're going to want to do is punch Aegon, then stall out for the Furies. Because if you have Mystic Dispersion active, effective. Once those Furies drop, you get a bunch of power. Just be careful. Sometimes comboing into a special will also cause the 100% offensive ability accuracy reduction to affect your specials. So pretty much make sure that you punch into Aegon, then dash back, then use your specials. Especially if you're trying to use like a special 3 or something with like Sim Supreme or Doom. Next up is Mr. Sinister. Critical hits increase the defender's power rate. Defender gets scaling Furies on special attacks. Common attackers here are Torch and Void. Yes, I recommend you boost. Despair is very useful if you're using Torch or Void for the reverse healing. With Torch, you're going to want to bait special 1s. The Reflected Incinerates will give you Smolders. Heal Reversal will boost your damage, and Nova Flames, when you have high Smolders, will give you good damage. But if you're relying on that Heal Reversal, remember that you don't need to use the pre-fight because the Incinerates give you more heal reversing with Despair Mastery. For Void, Heal Reversal allows you to play this fight pretty much as a standard Void and get extra damage for it on crits. Just again, make sure you bait the L1s for Mr. Sinister because it is still, a standard Mr. Sinister fight. Next up is Thing. There's no real nodes here. Common attackers are Aegon, Hitmonkey, Sabretooth, Void, Ghost. Typically speaking, I recommend you use boosts unless you're intentionally ramping Aegon or Sabretooth. There's no major mastery considerations. There are standard Thing mechanics here. If you're using Aegon, the less confident you are fighting Thing, the more important it is that you quit out and save your combo. There are many ways to get the 15 hit requirement. The first is like a 6-hit parry heavy. This will allow you to repeatedly knock Thing down and hopefully get a more aggressive AI profile. A second method is like a 5-hit combo where you do a medium, light, and then that will get you to 15 that way. And then the final one is like 6 hit, and then 3 hits into block, etc., or finding your way alternatively there. Next is Sabretooth. Don't bank the Fury from the 10 hits for Sabretooth because he does have a cap on the Furies he can bank. You only want to bank the SP3 Fury. You can do this by getting to a combo of 10, wait for the Fury to fall off, then launch the SP3 and quit out of the game. Next up, quit out of the fight. Next up is Void. You just slow play. Damage over time is your major damage source. Otherwise, you just play around Thing. Next up is Red Skull. While below 1 bar of power, attacks against Red Skull suffer 90% reduced attack. While below 2 bars, attacks suffer minus 50% attack. And while above or at 2 bars, attacks gain plus 25% attack. Common attackers here are Doom, Nick Fury, Aegon, Magneto, and Corvus. Yes, I recommend you boost. For masteries, Petrify is useful if you're using Magneto, but it is optional. For Doom, you're going to want to use the standard Doom double Fury rotation, but make sure that you parry medium once or twice before you launch your L2 because you do want Red Skull at 2 bars of power when landing the Incinerates. Another option, which I found to be more consistent, is to use Doom and L3 only. Essentially, you just maintain the double Fury, try to keep Red Skull at or above 2 bars of power for the entire fight, and then just launch the L3 over and over and over again and let your L3 do most of your damage. If you're using Nick Fury, you want to set up Unblockable, push Red Skull to the L2, stick some bleeds on him, and then inevitably die to chip damage, but it is a really good damage option per revive. If you're using Aegon, it's better if you're Unblockable, which might not be an option depending on who you have for Massacre. But generally speaking, once you get Red Skull above 2 bars of power, you can get really good SP2s off with Aegon. If you're confident you can get a heavy charge L2, that's really good for bleeds. It's just tricky and can absolutely get you killed if you mess it up. If you're using Magneto, you want to punish Red Skull's L1 with your heavy to charge and ramp your prowesses. Once you have your prowesses ramped up, you're very carefully going to want to push them to just barely 2 bars of power and then launch your L3. This is where Petrify comes into play. If you parry then SP3, he's going to have slightly reduced power gain. That way you don't accidentally push Red Skull to an L3, which can very, very happen because if he's just like a little too far into 2+ power, he will go straight to an L3 and it's a bad time. Next up is Bishop. Critical hits versus Bishop suffer minus 100% attack. Whenever bled, he regenerates 58,000 health over 5 seconds and gains power. Draining 1 or more bars of power in a single instant causes him to suffer a bunch of damage, direct damage. Your common attackers here are Doom, Torch, Warlock on Magic. Honestly, generally speaking, if you're using one of these, you just ignore the node for the most part. Yes, no, you do not need to boost. I apologize. And then for all of the champions, the way you're taking this Bishop down is that he gains prowess charges from energy damage. And when he's above 30, he starts to suffer massive direct damage. This is the kill method for all the champions that I mentioned. So for Doom, you're going to use shocks from his medium to ramp the prowesses, and then you're going to use Doom L3 only rotation, and then you want to make sure you don't let Bishop launch his special, and then it's a free fight. He just drops down in like 70 seconds. If you're using Torch, your Incinerates will ramp Bishop's prowesses. Your plan here is to ramp Torch up to an L2, and then you're going to want to slow combo L2 stun and then stall as much as possible. You don't want to let Bishop special, and while he's sitting at that high prowess, he will eventually burn out. Torch works really well for that fight. Next up is Warlock. You want to keep Bishop below 1 bar of power the entire fight. One good way to do this is to use heavies and infection to bleed / power drain Bishop, because the bleeds will give him that heal, and then you can just let them power drain and just only do heavies and bleeds, parry heavies until you can get to like an SP1 spam once Bishop is like above 30 prowess. So the SP1 shock will raise his prowess, and then the parry bleeds will keep him below a bar of power. It takes a while, but eventually once he's over 30 prowess, you can just parry, wait it out, and he will go down. Next up is Magic. You're going to want to use the standard L2 power lock. Once you have Bishop power lock, just keep it up. Don't let him gain any bars of power. The Limbo will deal energy damage and eventually push him to the above 30 prowess and will take him down. Next up is Symbiote Supreme. Striking Sim Supreme with a critical hit grants him a mana burn charge. When he hits 20 charges, they are all removed, and he gains a power flood effect, granting 1.5 bars of power over 25 seconds. While this is active, the attacker takes direct damage unless Sim Supreme is power locked. Do not use Aegon. Generally speaking, people use Torch. Also, generally speaking, low crit chance champions, any of those will work. It is recommended that you turn precision off, but you don't have to. Turning dexterity off can help manage Sim's phase change / power gain, as well as avoid the nullification damage from his Cthulhu's phase. You don't have to turn dexterity off. It can just help. Also, just be mind, if you have dexterity active, be careful not to have the precision buff active when Sim enters the Cthulhu's cunning phase. That's the phase he starts in, and then he rotates into 3 phases later. Because essentially, you're going to take a bunch of free damage from the precision. It's a bad time. And then just make sure you only dex when dodging the SP2 if Cthulhu's phase is not active. Because if you dex it while it is, you're going to take a whole bunch of direct damage. If it isn't active, just remember that you can't dex the SP2. Just parry it. It's not hard to parry, and you'll be okay. For Massacre, if either champion lands an attack, they inflict a fracture charge on their opponent. Each fracture charge reduces block proficiency by 400 and can eventually invert block damage reduction. Massacre is indestructible while he isn't blocking. While his opponent is blocking, he fights more aggressively, and while he isn't blocking, attacks against Massacre gain plus 100% attack. Common attackers here are Aegon, Corvus, and honestly anyone. No, you don't really need to boost. For all champions, hit Massacre 60 to 70 times minimum, then bait blocks, and then hit into his block for big damage once you've got his block proficiency reduced. Aegon, you do not want Aegon to go to 1000 combo, otherwise you're going to go unblockable and it's a bad time. So just something to consider. Next up is Omega Red. Critical hits increase the defender's power rate. Defender gets scaling furies on special attacks. You can use literally anyone here. Yes, I recommend you boost for bigger damage. No mastery considerations, and just make sure you bait SP1s or you bring a robot, and don't take blocked hits from the SP1s. It is a lot of chip damage. Go ahead and take that Omega Red down. Next up is Medusa. Every 30 seconds, she gains a 15-second unstoppable buff. Nullifying a buff on the defender resets the timer. This is an easier takedown if you have anti-auto block, mystics, or honestly, anyone can do this fight. Yes, I recommend you boost up. The only mastery you could consider really is Mystic Dispersion. If you're not using a Mystic / Nullify option, just parry 2-hit while the unstoppable buff is open, and you'll be fine. Cable. Critical hits against Cable cause him to gain a dynamo charge. Each of the Cable's landed or blocked strikes deal a flat 100 energy damage to the opponent for each charge. Common attackers here are Void, Torch, Red Magneto, and Aegon. Yes, you should boost up for this fight unless you're planning on healing reversing, in which case it's not really needed. If you're heal reversing, use Despair. For Void, while Cable is above 25%, every time he gains a bar of power, he has a small chance to gain a regeneration. Just stack up your Petrify / debuffs, then repeatedly push Cable to SP1 and SP2 and hope you get lucky. Just be mindful that if he kills you and he is sub 25%, you need to kill him with normal damage. Human Torch, same concept. Do not use your pre-fight when heal reversing. While Cable is above 25%, every time he gains a bar of power, he has a small chance to gain a regeneration. Just stack up your Incinerates, push him to an SP1, SP2, hope you get lucky. Keep in mind, if he kills you and he is sub 25%, you do need to finish him off with normal damage. If you're using Red Magneto, SP3 all day, the degen from his bleeds is small, so don't even worry about it. That's kind of the major concern is if you're using a bleeder, the degen has some threat, but it's not a lot of degen damage. It's based off his base attack, not his boosted attack. For Aegon, enjoy the chip damage, but Aegon does do good damage and will get this guy down eventually. He's not the greatest option, but it is an option nonetheless. Next up is Karnak. Dexterity and parry mastery do not function in this fight. Both champions are permanently power locked. The attacker suffers minus 50% attack, but gains 2% for each hit on their combo meter. Aegon is the most common attacker. Anyone who can heavy corner can do this fight, and typically anyone can do this fight if you're just really good at intercepting. Yes, you should boost up just to make sure you get that extra damage. No, there's no major mastery considerations. If you're using Aegon, the unblockable gives you an easy opening. Standard backdraft intercepts or heavy counters work as well. Aegon can also easily heavy corner Karnak if you prefer to do that method. Heavy corner champions just push Karnak to the corner, and then heavy corner, rinse and repeat. And then if you're just using anyone, just get good at intercepting. He is power locked, so you can just punch into him over and over again. And then for the collector, you're going to have to look it up on your own. I personally just strong arm this guy. You only have to do it 5 times. So if you don't have any interest in proper learning the fight, know that I didn't either. As always, I hope you enjoyed. I hope this is helpful for some of you, and I'll talk to you all later. Peace.